Hello and welcome to a session on test design and test translation issues. Translation is probably one of the most underrated and important issues in test adaptation. If you think about it, I think we all have responded to numerous questionnaires, surveys on the phone, sent to our email. We have participated in tests. We have been in interviews, and all of these all these things require like very careful calibration of the words that we're using. Think also about test instructions. Imagine answering some survey about some sensitive political issues, and then the instructions basically send you into a completely different direction. So tests and test adaptation for the specific context, for the specific purposes, and the translation of tests into different languages is a really, really important issue. It's also a very important business. So a lot of tests get developed in one context and then need to be adapted, translated, contextualized for different contexts. For example, even within the English-speaking world, talking for example about the New Zealand market, even though English is used, the way people talk in New Zealand obviously is slightly different from like how people talk in the US or in the UK, where most of the tests are developed. And the New Zealand market is too small to develop, typically to develop like New Zealand-based tests, for example. And so what people do is they look for established tests in the US, in Canada, or in the UK, to then like adapt them, translate them to a Kiwi English. And so we have options for developing tests. First of all, we have to think about, is there an existing test out there? If there is, hooray, we can look at it. And then we have to think about, can we just adopt them? So we take the test, we may make some like small kind of adjustments, potentially what we will talk about shortly, like a close translation. And we basically ask the same questions again. Alternatively, if there's a test out there, but it has some content that does not really apply, then we need to adapt the test. So we need to increase the cultural appropriateness. In case that we don't have a test readily out there that we can use, then we have to think about, okay, how do we best develop a test for our purposes? And there are essentially three different pathways that we can go down to. The first one is we can use what is called a sequential approach, where we develop a source questionnaire and we test that, and then as we need it, we will translate it sequentially into other languages. A second one is if we already know that we have a number of people working in different language contexts or different cultural contexts, then we can, as a group, we develop our questionnaire, our survey, our tests in parallel, and so like everyone contributes to that. The last one, which is somewhat similar to parallel, is simultaneous test development. It uses what is called a decentering approach, where like we have an iterative translation process where like step by step all the kind of cultural specifics are eliminated. So if you think about it from an equivalence and bias perspective, what we have is we use only what is absolutely functionally equivalent on all the different contexts. So we implement a common core, and that might then be implemented in country-specific ways. So this kind of emic, ethic, common set could then, of course, also be supplemented by country-specific emic sets, right? So the idea is that you have a core of items that is applicable in all the contexts, and then you have potentially country, language, culture specific components that are in addition to that core set, right? So those are the kind of broad options that we have for developing a test. So when adapting a test, so we are in that framework where a test is out there and we now need to think about how we can make it fit better our local context. We have to consider a number of different issues. So if we have, for example, tests on political literacy, we have to, of course, adapt all the questions about, for example, when was the last election, what type of government does your country have? So those kind of questions need to be adapted. One issue that is very difficult often is the issue of gendered languages. A number of languages have specific genders for every single word, and so often it's encoded in the ending, but some languages, like Germanic languages, you have gender, but it is not directly encoded in the word itself, but comes with an article. So, we have to consider that, whether that actually makes some questions misleading or too specific. Right? So if you have, for example, gendered languages and all occupations have a male and a female option and you use only one of the options, then obviously you exclude people of the different gender from that particular question. Or you could also think about, like if you have multiple gender options for each word, and then you have to include all of these options in a question, that might make questions very long and difficult to understand. So they're often quite tricky issues if you deal with gendered languages. We also have to think about conventions, right? So writing directions, for example. We are typically writing from left to right, but a number of languages write from right to left or from top to bottom. So these kind of issues may change how people understand questions and may make some questions, for example, in intelligence questions or in attention tests, might make them easier or more difficult. And of course, cultural adaptation. So fitting the questions to fit the specific cultural context of where we want to apply our test. So what are advantages versus disadvantages for adopting versus adapting? As you can imagine, adopting a test, so taking a test that is out there and just very straightforward translation, is much easier. It's relatively inexpensive. There are lots of statistical techniques that we can apply straight out of the box, so we can compare the new test applied in a new sample and run a traditional equivalence test on it without further problems. Questionnaires are typically already pre-tested in their original language, in their original context, so we have a lot of stuff that we can rely on to compare the performance of our test. On the other hand, adopting tests, like we kind of take everything kind of whole package, right? So there might be cultural anchoring, so all sorts of issues around cultural suitability and specific translation problems that make the test maybe less applicable in the new environment, right? And also, issues around, for example, closed translations often are a big issue. On the other hand, if we use adapting, so we make our test fit the local environment, of course, it's easier and less expensive than starting with the development of a completely new test. So that's good. It's still relatively inexpensive. We are also adapting the test, so the test is typically much better suited for the local context, right? So that's an advantage over just straightforward adopting of tests. And so various adaptations are possible. The problem, though, then becomes, once we have an adapted test and we want to compare the results to the previous versions that were developed in a different context, we run into statistical problems. How do we compare the similar stimuli? If we change the instrument, if we change the test too much, then we can't really directly compare any kind of results anymore. So for example, if we have test scores with norming, for example, can be a real issue. It also requires extensive documentation. You have to document what you did and why. I can tell you from experience that is easily said and even more easily forgot. The number of times when we adapted some tests and we thought like, this is so obvious, let's make this change here and we will remember why we did this. And then 3 weeks down the track, a month, 2 months down the track, you look at it and you go like, I know I made this change, but I can't remember why I did it. Right? So document why you're making changes and what the rationale is for it, so that you can later go back to it and have a very clear documentation and can tell others why you did this. And also another issue is if you adapt tests, and for example we have adapted tests for different environments within one research program, then you have all sorts of different test versions and you need to coordinate all these different adaptations, so that for example in South Africa we used this version and that version, but in Holland we used that version only, because it gets very difficult and can get very confusing if you have a number of different versions of adapted tests, and then you have to work out what test was used where and why and when. So these are the kind of advantages and disadvantages of using adopting versus adapting tests that are already out there. So now let's have a look at the options for developing new tests. So we could look at sequential tests where we start off with a test, develop a new test in a new context, and then sequentially adapt or translate them into other contexts. So first of all, in the target context, we have potentially a very high cultural context suitability. We can identify all sorts of conceptual problems, functional equivalence problems, item bias problems, especially if we properly test them. And there are also ways of using straightforward statistical tests, again, invariance equivalence tests. Obviously, there are development costs. Sequential tests, sequentially developed tests are still cheaper than some of the other versions, but still costs. It's not as cheap as just adapting or adopting a test that is already out there. And another big issue is, even though you develop your test from scratch, the cross-cultural suitability is often not pre-tested. So even though you develop a new test in a specific context, because it is already relatively costly, people don't have the resources to then pre-test the instrument to the extent that you would typically want to. Now, moving to parallel tests, where you develop tests in parallel with a joint research team. You are probably very good at identifying all sorts of issues. So typically the instrument that results from a parallel test development is very good in terms of, so it's very suitable for the different environments. It's relatively, or it's less likely that you have significant concept or item bias issues. And with a parallel test, because everyone is involved and then you end up with a common version, it's really easy to apply standard statistical tests for equivalence invariance. And so this is one of the great advantages. So for example, European Social Survey, some of the modules are developed in parallel, for example. And the European Social Survey is probably, if you want, the kind of gold standard for transnational survey development at this moment. The downside of it is very costly and very complex. You have a big team working on it. You have to work across all the different language contexts, cultural contexts, country contexts, legal contexts simultaneously, and that often is very time consuming and very expensive. Now let's look at the last option, a simultaneous test development. Here we typically have a common denominator. So we have a set of items that can be applied in a straightforward, relatively abstract, so culturally decentered way across all the different contexts. So that's great, right? Because we have taken out all cultural contexts to the extent possible, concept and item bias issues are relatively unlikely. With that common set, we can apply all the statistical tests. We can test for invariance equivalence in a very straightforward way. So that's also great. So a lot of advantages for this approach. The disadvantage, similar to parallel development, these tests are typically very costly and complex. In addition to that, because we typically remove everything that is kind of rich cultural context, our test becomes often abstract, quite vague, and there's the threat that we don't represent all the concepts in the detail and the specificity that we need in any specific cultural context, right? So the removal of cultural specifics often can make a test, less user-friendly, less useful, less informative. So it may not actually be practical, because you might just throw out the baby with the bathwater. Right? So we have three different options that both or all three of them have advantages and disadvantages in terms of developing new tests. So if we adopt a test, if we adapt a test, or if we go down a parallel translation or a sequential development pathway, we always have to worry about translation. And there are two major approaches that we can take. The first one are so-called one-to-one or direct translations, and the second approach is to use what is called team-based translations. So one-to-one is typically a simple translation, which is cheaper, faster, relatively straightforward. The downside to that is that you often, because you have one person translating, then another person looking at it, you often have no explicit opportunity to discuss or develop alternative options. You also have all sorts of issues if you have one person looking at it. You have all sorts of issues with regional variations, idiosyncratic, like interpretations of items, because one person with his or her own interpretation of the test will look at it. So there are translator blind spots that might get unnoticed. So that's why a lot of people have moved towards team translation approaches. We have two major options here. We can, for example, develop a committee. So that picture here, that was a committee that we had in the Philippines, where we tried to translate value surveys. And you have two options. One is a parallel committee where everyone translates everything, and so then you compare the two translations, or you have a split committee where one group is using part of the survey and the other group is using the other part of the survey to like make it less work intensive, because as you can imagine, translation takes time, and if you have a very long source questionnaire, it can become very, very difficult to go through with one team. For example, with our translation in the Philippines, we started having what we call translation parties. I typically would buy lunch, and we would meet for like 2 hours over lunch, and it took us a week to translate a survey of about 200 questions, because there were a lot of issues, and we had a lot of discussions around that. So in the end, what we had to do was we had to split the instrument, because it was just too much, and we couldn't actually go through it in even like 2 hours a day for a week. And we can also, like a third option is so-called expert teams. So where you have experts that then go through the like the translation together as a team. Right. So This is the important thing that we have to decide on, like a one-to-one direct translation or translation in a team. If you work in a team, but also if you work with a one-to-one direct translation approach, you need to have a number of different people involved in order to get a high quality translation. Typically, what you have is at least one person who translates the survey. Then you have a second person that hopefully is independent from the translation process, who will review that translation. And then if there are discrepancies between the version that the translator looked at and comments by the translation reviewer, then you need somebody to make a decision on which version to adopt. The translation adjudicators here sometimes can be those individuals who develop the test. So for example, if I develop the test, I ask somebody to translate it in a second language. I ask somebody else to look at the quality of that translation. And then if there's some disagreement between the two of them, they come back to me, and then I will make a decision based on my conceptual, theoretical interest, which translation might be better. The important message here is translation is not a one-person job. It always involves multiple people. And also, translation is not a single one-step process. It is an iterative process that involves multiple steps, and these steps often are sequential, but then also you have to come back and make changes. Ideally, what you would do is what is called a trapped process. So you translate, somebody will review the translation, somebody will make a decision, so you have an adjudication process, and then you pre-test your survey. And we come to the pre-testing options in just a second. Then you need to document what your pre-test found and any kind of changes that you might want to make, and then often you have to go back and check your translation again, review the translation, make some decisions, and then pre-test again. So there's a constant back and forth between a translation review, decision-making process, a pre-testing and documentation process, and so on. This is how, for example, gold standards like what I mentioned, the European Social Survey, that's how they typically run their translation process. So it's very rigorous, and there's a lot of documentation going on. So how do you actually know whether your translation works? You can look at qualitative information, right? So you can look at the text itself and have a textual appraisal. Does it make sense? You can ask the people who will apply the tests or the questionnaires or surveys, so people who will do the interviews or do the phone calls, or psychologists who will work in schools with kids, for example. You will ask them for their feedback. You can do some cognitive testing or think aloud protocols where you get people to go through the test, and then they verbalize what is on their mind as they go through the test. So what are the kind of associations that they make in relation to any of the specific instructions, to the specific items, etc., etc. You can do this in focus groups. So you get a group of people together, and then they look at your survey, your interview guidelines, your test, and then they go through it and will make this, or give you feedback on each individual item. You can also use what is called back translation, but we will come back to that, to back translation issues in just a second. So this is a qualitative process on the translation. There's also a qualitative process on the actual instrument pre-testing. So if you translate a survey into a second language, you can get bilinguals, and you can get those bilinguals to answer the survey in both languages and then get their feedback. You can also just get people in the target language, ask them to respond to the survey, and as if it was a testing situation, and then afterwards sit down with them and do a debrief. what did you think of it, how did it work, etc., etc. The same with field staff, right? So here now, field staff look at it this time not so much from a textual perspective, but from an application perspective. So like if you ask your field staff to apply the test with a number of participants, and then you do a debrief and ask them what worked well, what didn't work well. Again, you can do cognitive testing, so look at the cognitive processes that are going on when people answering your test or questionnaire. You can use focus groups as you go and test your instrument. And you can also use comprehension tests. So you can do a test on the test to see how well people actually understood it. With pre-testing, you can also then do a lot of quantitative analyses. So you can what is called a double ballot administration. So you apply the test in the two languages, and with bilinguals, for example, and then you compare the results. Do you get different patterns? Do you get different correlations, means, etc., etc.? You can do this the same thing with bilinguals, where they either answer one or the other version, and then you look at whether the means and correlations are the same. You can use more sophisticated options like item response theory, structural equation modeling, or multi-trait, multi-method options, and you compare the performance of the test in different populations depending on what kind of translation you used. So you have a whole toolkit available for at your hands that you can use to see whether your instrument was translated in a way that it is usable in your new cultural or linguistic environment. So now a quick word on translation-backed translation. What it actually means, it's a relatively old form. Brislin talked about it in the 1970s. The idea is that you translate the test from your original language into a target language, and then an independent person takes the target language, so the translated version, and translates it back into the original version. Right? So if I developed a test, let's say in English, I ask my mate to translate it, let's say, into Russian, and then I ask another different person to translate it from Russian back into English. Then I will look at the two English versions and can make a decision on whether the test actually was translated well or not. That's the idea. It's relatively cheap. You only need 2 people. It's easy, it's fast, it can be done at a distance. At the same time, though, it's the most problematic form of translation. There are lots of issues with translation-backed translation. One of the major issues is that if there is a problem in the original translation, and then that problematic translation is like reverted back into the original language, you may have a real issue with your test, and you don't actually see it because the English versions are very comparable. There's no independent verification of the meaning. So a great example that I always love is, for example, the German term das Leben in vollen Zügen genießen. What if you translate it literally? It's like to live. If you look at it, what it means is basically to enjoy life. That's what you want to convey with this expression. The way it is expressed, though, looking at it, is basically the life, to enjoy life in packed trains. And if you translate this, do you enjoy life in packed trains from German into English, and then somebody else translates that back, you will have the same meaning, right? But it does not convey what you're really after, which is this enjoyment of life, rather than being a strange kind of person, enjoying life on the Japanese subway. I don't know. Anyway, there might be people like that out there. So That's the problem. Translation back translation, you might completely miss an issue with a specific item because it's not apparent in the back translation. On the other hand, though, back translation can be quite useful in the context of team-based approaches because as you discuss it as a team, some of the issues that may not come to the fore as in a team can actually be quite useful to discuss. So I would not recommend translation back translation if it was only one person translating, another person translating back. But in the context of a team-based translation, it can actually be quite useful, especially if you get the two teams back together afterwards and then discuss any kind of discrepancies. You have to think about who can translate your tests or your instruments. The kind of default option that a lot of people use if they've never worked with translation is to get a professional translator or a bilingual to translate your test. And I just put it here in bold. It is often a really bad choice. Why? First of all, professional translators, or bilinguals, it doesn't matter. They're typically completely unfamiliar with the test or with measurement in general, and so they do not understand what you're after. What do you need to capture when translating a test? Because testing is not the language that we use for testing is typically not the language that we use in everyday conversations. So professional translators are very good at translating on the spot language into different languages, like how people are talking, right? Or it's something that they do for a living, but they are not typically trained to translate tests which have very specific demands. They're not familiar with test design structures and target populations. Why do you use certain words? Who is your target audience? Because they see their target audience, right? Because they're translating in a specific environment. And one of the issues that you often have with professional translators is they try and stick very close to a literal translation. And so, like very subtle meaning changes might happen. So that's an issue. So what is a good option, in my view, is to use professional translators or bilinguals to assess translated versions, right? Because then they can look at the text and they are typically very good to spot stuff that, like grammatical issues or some kind of jargon or terminology that might come with the territory of having a psychological test, right? So professional translators or bilinguals may not be the best option for translating instruments into a second language. So who are good people, and more importantly even training your people. Training your translators is again one of those like little things that makes all the difference, but a lot of people just don't think about it. A lot of researchers don't think about training their translators. So what are the tools that you need? You need to have you need to provide a job description. Tell your translators who is going to answer that test, that survey, that interview. What is their level of literacy? Why are you doing it? Is it an opinion poll? Is it something that you might use in the context of a school testing environment? Is it a research project? What are the objectives? Like these are kind of these pieces of information are very important for translators to choose the language, choose the complexity of their wording. Then train your translators. Use an old questionnaire that has been translated already to practice. Get your translators, for example, to observe some pre-testing so they get a better understanding of what is actually happening with the material that they're going to translate. And use annotations. I have worked a lot with people like Shalom Schwartz, and he's amazing. because he typically, like he sends you a version of his survey that he wants to get translated, and with that survey comes a whole list of annotations to tell you, like what is the meaning, what you want to capture with a specific item. And he often, he often uses like old translations from other value surveys and goes like, I don't want this, but I want that. What would be the closest translation for that? Yeah. So train your trainers, provide them with information, provide them with old questionnaires to practice, and so on and so on. And then set some performance specifications. This is actually quite hard because often there are no clear standards or criteria for translations, but try and find some. And I will talk about a checklist right at the end of the session, which tries to set some kind of performance specifications along a set of certain criteria. So use that one because that is really, really good and can be used very well in the context of training translators. So one thing that I already kind of tapped into a few times is this kind of distinction between very literal, like very close translations, and so-called pragmatic translations. Literal or close translations, they try to capture the original source material as close as possible. The problem with that is it often can create very stilted, unnatural language in the target language. This is often also, if you think about Google Translate can be horrible because, like it just takes a word and then just translates that word into a second language without really thinking, like Google can't think obviously, but without taking the larger meaning into the larger context into consideration. So close translations can be very, very can be kind of the standard approach for a lot of people that are not trained with test translations, but it can result in very strange items, meanings that have changed, that don't make sense anymore, or they might actually give meaning away. A good example is if you translate, for example, an IQ test item for kids, right? So what animal, where does an animal with webbed feet live, right? So what animals have webbed feet? Ducks, for example, right? So where does a duck live? In water, right? So webbed feet, is an indicator, or is a crucial part of the question to see whether a child understands the word webbed feet and then can make the inference that this animal has to live in water, right? So if you translate this into some of the Germanic languages where the term webbed feet doesn't really exist, and instead the term is used swimming feet, right? So right now, if you have a question like, where does an animal with swimming feet live? the item becomes kind of meaningless as an IQ item because the answer is already part of the question, right? So these kind of literal close translations can create problems. On the other hand, we can use pragmatic translations. Here we really look at meaning in context. So what is said, what are the intentions, what is the common ground between participant, typically the tester and the testee, what is the micro-macro context. So a question, like, can you open the door, like in a normal conversation, is not the question whether you are able to open the door, but it typically means, can you please open the door for me, right? So when we ask questions, there's all this kind of macro contextual context that is going on, right? So for test translations, survey translations, this context often matters. A lot of languages have different ways to express relationships, for example. So how can you capture those relationships, the connotations that come with relationships with instructions in a different language in the best possible way, right? So pragmatic translations are the way to go for, But you have to be very careful because, as you can imagine, the way you translate your items may actually change the complexity of items, may change the intent of items, and so that's something to be careful about. One other issue are so-called interpretation problems. So quite often what can happen if you have only one item or measure for a specific concept, then you translate it, and then you get your results back. It's very difficult to identify, is it actually a linguistic issue, so is it a translation issue, or is something going on there that indicates cultural differences at a deeper level. So for example, curiosity is one of those terms that can have very interesting quote unquote connotations in different languages. Right, so now does that mean that there's a problem with the connotation of curiosity and the concept does not exist in the same way in different cultural contexts? Or is it that you took a specific translation of curiosity that implied some specific type of meaning, right? So that's often very difficult to disentangle if you have just one measure or item for a specific context. So people say, like, use at least 3 linguistically distinct measures items of the same construct. Great. Makes your test much longer, obviously. And depending on the language structure, the how the language actually operates, different items may not actually remedy the problem. It might just replicate linguistic problems or distinctions. And so, yes, it is better to do that, but it may not always get you around this kind of problem. Is it actually a linguistic issue or is it a culture issue? You could wonder what happens if we avoid words at all. Could nonverbal scales work better? And there are plenty of examples out there. So, for example, one option that we used a few years ago in a study was we asked people to indicate whether they're closer to a Mauritian or to a Hindu identity, right? So the key thing was for us was ask participants to move the slider towards one end or the other. But obviously we still had the instructions up here that needed to be translated. Another option which is very common these days is down here, these circles, these overlapping circles, to measure, like how interdependent or how identified you are with a specific group, right? So, for example, I have a smaller circle here, and then it's con eng, so that is me. And here we used it in the context of a temple. So San Jiao is basically a temple or shrine, and so the idea would be to measure how close you feel to the shrine, right? So obviously version A here, you're quite distinct. Version G, you're completely identified, immersed, fused with the temple, and a few others, like for example C here, where you're kind of connected but not merged, for example. Makes all good sense, right? Looking at this. The problem is people might not understand what the heck you're going on about. When we use this kind of survey, typically people either went for option C or went for option G, and then the answer was like either I used C because I'm connected to the shrine, but obviously I cannot impose myself onto the shrine. So they interpret it as a kind of imposition. And other people went for G, and they argued, well, obviously I'm part of the shrine, I live through the shrine through my religion. So you can see, without the kind of explicit instructions, people make all sorts of assumptions of what your circles might mean in a specific context. Another option that is very, very common on one hand, for example, is use these kind of rating scales where, like you tell people to choose an option. So this is something that we did in Samoa and Fiji a few years back. We tried to use the World Value Survey and raise a representative sample across the different islands. And so the World Value Survey uses a lot of numerical scales. So they don't have verbal scales, and then you always have to say, like 1 is the lowest, 10 is the highest. Where do you think you're sitting in relation to this? Again, all sorts of languages and cultures have different associated meanings with numbers. So you may not actually capture the right context, or you might not capture what you're thinking you're capturing when using those numbers. A classic example, for example, in the UK many years ago, a friend of mine was telling me that a major bank was doing a survey of satisfaction with the banking services, and the person was really puzzled because every time they rang up students, like they would not go above, back then it was 70%, and he was really puzzled. What is happening? We're asking people like how happy you are with your banking services on a scale from 1 to 100%, and students always just give 70%. Of course, it made sense from a student perspective, because an A plus back then with that particular grading scheme was 70%, and nobody ever got above 70%. So why should the bank get over 70%? It's kind of a funny example, but yeah, you can get these kind of connotations with numbers that you might not be aware of. And the same thing with, for example, pictorial scales. Like there are all sorts of meanings, all sorts of connotations associated with pictures that you may or may not be aware of when you're using them. So, like you basically push the interpretation problem to the respondent, and you have no idea what is going on in the respondent's mind. And also, like you might have issues coming back, for example, to the issues with the direction of reading, like depending on like which direction people are used to look at a text, for example, they may interpret this question differently depending on their like reading direction, right? So that is to say that if we use nonverbal scales, we don't really get around the problem. There's still issues with that. So let's get to the last part, which is a translation checklist. It's in a really amazing book, Conducting Research Across Cultures, or Cross-Cultural Research Methods, by Matsumoto and Fons van der Wyver. And in that book, there's an awesome chapter on translation and a generic translation checklist. It divides the issues that you have to look at into 5 different areas, and I will just quickly go through some of these issues, right? So what I would recommend you to do is take the instrument that you're interested in, think about the language that you want to use, and then go through it and think about how you might need to translate, or what kind of issues you need to look at when translating your instrument into your new target language. Right. So the first thing is, just in general, looking at the whole text, do the concepts make sense? So construct bias issues. What is the relative difficulty or commonality of words? Because some words are used more frequently in some languages compared to others. Right? Do translations in general change the context of a test or of an item? Right. So the for example, substitutions, right? So the webbed feet becomes swimming feet, which obviously makes a huge difference if it was a test item. And also the metaphors, idioms, colloquialisms, right? The issue of to enjoy life in packed full trains, right? It's a metaphor, and we don't want to translate a metaphor, but we want to capture the meaning. We have to look at the item format. Is the item format the same across languages? Languages vary where you put, for example, verbs, which direction you write, etc., etc. So this can change the layout quite a bit depending on what you want to do. Some languages have very complex compound words. German is a classic example where you can, instead of using a whole sentence, you can pack it into one word, which obviously now changes the length of the item or the answer choices, etc. The format of the items or tasks, so this classic instrument bias issue, may or may not be similar. You have to think about, do you want to emphasize certain words or phrases? If you want to emphasize them, would it be possible to actually emphasize them in all the languages, or do you run into problems where you suddenly have not just one term, but like a subclause within a phrase, for example? And you have to think about, is there only one correct answer in all the languages, which is a big issue for educational tests. Now moving to a quick discussion point, or like something to reflect on. You may want to think about, what response format would you recommend for what purpose and what audiences? So do you want to have some nonverbal response options, like what I showed you before? Do you want to use dichotomous response options that are relatively simple, or do you want to have calibrated Likert type style response options where you go from strongly disagree to strongly agree? Right. So this is something that you really have to think about, and also have to think about when you translate it. Right. So it's something to be aware of and to actively think about when conducting a translation. So now, grammar and phrasing issues. This is a really complex linguistic issue where items can be changed in terms of their complexity, depending on the words, depending on the linguistic structures. There are issues like, for example, grammatical clues, right? So, for example, if you have gendered languages, right? So the gender is already included in the word in some languages, right? So that may influence how easy or difficult a question is. If you ask, for example, for a profession, and then ask, like whether like the profession is typically like associated with a male or female person taking that profession, right? So here it's already often like encoded in the word in gendered languages. You might have very unique grammatical structures that are very difficult to translate into target languages. Tenses, for example, are a classic example. English has a very rich tense temporal structure, right? A lot of languages have very simple structures where you sometimes not even have a past or a simple past, right? So then, like you need to use a specific word to indicate that the action has happened already. So that changes obviously how people will engage with test items. I already talked about gender or other references and words that may provide cues. Often, like you have multiple meanings of specific words that are not apparent in the original language, or vice versa. For example, a few years ago we translated a leadership questionnaire into Arabic, and we just used the term leader, and then apparently in Arabic you have to specify leader in what context: organizational context, political context, because there are apparently different terms involved. Same with group. In English, like a group is a relatively neutral term. A lot of languages have multiple words for group with different connotations. So what is the group? In what context are we talking about? Context are we talking about? Does the group include the speaker or not? So there are all these kind of very subtle changes across languages that you need to think about. Also, punctuation, commas, for example. English is relatively comma-free. Other languages, for example, like German again, or Russian, is very specific about where you put a comma, and then where you put a comma completely can change the meaning. Right? So again, something to think about. Looking at whole passages, you have to think about, do words, phrases convey the similar meanings. You have to think about stereotypes. I mentioned, for example, gender stereotypes in relation to professions, right? So are there specific stereotypes that you convey unwillingly by using specific words or certain connotations? You have to think about controversial or inflammatory topics. I already mentioned a few times the issue of, like avoiding, like for example, references to a royal family or to certain social groups in certain languages. Certain terms can change in meaning, and so some terms can become very offensive or demeaning with social changes, right? So that's something to be very aware of. Even when you take, a test that has been applied, language changes. So some terms that might have been okay 20 years ago may not be okay today. You have to think about the language skills that people have, and whether the terms and words are all familiar to potential respondents. And you have to think about, for example, if you have graphics, tables, other kind of visual elements, do they have actually the same meaning, the same complexity, the same elements in all the different languages? And of course, we have to think about cultural connotations. Do terms make sense in a specific cultural context? Is there different social desirability? Can you talk as freely about some topics as you can in English? And would that actually make a difference in terms of how willing people are to express agreement or disagreement? Some very simple things, for example, measurement units may not be applicable. The good old imperial versus metric system. Ask me how much is an inch in centimeters, and I'm lost every single time. Or like weigh somebody's weight, like in stones. Excuse me? First time like when I got to the UK, and somebody asked me, so how much do you weigh in stones? And I was like, stones? Excuse me? That was a test item, if you really think about it, at the doctor's office, and I failed the test. I didn't know my weight in stones. You have to think about whether the concepts actually exist at the same level of abstraction. Like, for example, identity is something that we throw around quite easily in English, right? So what's your identity, etc., etc. Some languages may not have a term, or may have borrowed the term from English, which then becomes a relatively abstract word that nobody uses, right? And so you have to think about, do these concepts, the constructs, do they have the same familiarity and meaning in the source and target languages? And so what you have to really think about is, how can you improve bad translations? The issue is not so much that your translation has problems. All translations do have problems. There is no perfect translation. But the issue is, how can you improve the translation, or like the problems with the specific translations, for the purposes of your research project or your applied work? This is really what matters, right? So you have to decide what you have to do in order to capture what you are interested in relation to your project, in relation to your work, right? So that is really what you have to think about. And this is related to what kind of translation procedure you want to use. What kind of translation procedure you want to use, how you want to train your translators, how you test for whether your translation meets your criteria, your standards that you need or not, right? So this is really the major challenge for you, right? How can you get to a translation that is good enough for the purposes that you need? And so, just finishing off, translation is one of those things that, like, people just take for granted. It appears so simple, right? So let's just quickly translate a test and then run our study. But if you start looking at it, it's actually very, very complex, and it taps into all these issues that we talked about. It taps into functional equivalence, so construct bias issues. It is all about structural equivalence. It is all about item biases, right? So translation is really at the core of all these kind of issues that we later try and work through statistically. And so translation, and good translation, needs to be implemented as a crucial part of the research process. So that is it, and if you have questions, I can't wait to hear from you. And good luck. May the God of translations be with you.